Hey friends, thanks for joining me, Jim Baroud, to hear a few insights from leaders who represent our innovation ecosystem. Today's chat is with Mark Metry, a 23-year-old entrepreneur, author, creator, mental health advocate, coach, keynote speaker, and podcast host, and Bryan Noar, the VP of Client Success at Avadon Health, a leading provider of coaching solutions proven to break unhealthy habits for diverse populations. Bryan, let's start with you. Go ahead. Tell everyone about yourself.
Well, as you'll tell very quickly from my accent, I'm not from the United States. I was born in the small African country now known as Zimbabwe. It used to be a British colony. And I actually grew up during a civil war and came to the United States because I needed to build a new future for myself. Believe it or not, I know this picture doesn't show it, but I battled obesity my entire childhood and growing up years. I actually became a CPA by profession. I don't know whether it was a gift or a nemesis. I was blessed with being able to do numbers well. And I actually made a complete change in my life. I managed to overcome my issues with obesity. And part of that was a big aha moment. I had changed my diet and my lifestyle, and all these health issues I was experiencing started to go away. And all of a sudden, one day I woke up and realized that the food I put in my mouth wasn't there to make me full and make me pleasured and satisfied. It was actually there with a bigger purpose. And I'd studied biology in high school, and I just had this massive motivation and inspiration to get involved in health and wellness after that. So I quit counting beans and started on my career in the health and wellness industry, and I've been there ever since.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bryan. Mark, go ahead.
Bryan, it was great to hear that. I also care a lot about nutrition. So for me, I'm a son of immigrants from Egypt. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I was always an entrepreneur. I got in like the online tech scene when social media, when YouTube were first starting. I launched all kinds of different online businesses. And personally, for me, I always had a history of social anxiety. I grew up in this small town that had no racial diversity. And in a world of post 9/11, if you're a Middle Eastern or Arab, you definitely, faced quite a bit of discrimination. And so for me, I was sort of stuck in this bubble where I really didn't talk to anybody. I just tried to stay quiet my entire life. I was shy. And next thing I knew, when I was about 18, all of a sudden I start to face these other problems, obesity being one of them. My social anxiety turned into social isolation. I became seriously depressed for the first time in my life. I couldn't really sleep anymore. And there was really this period in my life where it truly felt like my brain broke. And I was even suicidal for a period of time. And so when I experienced that about 6 years ago, that really kind of woke me up to I'm either really going to be a statistic in the bad way or the good way. And so ever since then, that's really when I started to understand like, oh, mental health is a real thing. It's not just sort of in your head. And throughout that process, I've been recovering. And throughout those years, I started a Yahoo Finance and Forbes Future Top 100 podcast. I launched other kinds of businesses. I wrote a book called Screw Being Shy, gave a TEDx talk, and really just try to center all my conversations, everything I do online, offline, really just about what I think is the most important thing, which is mental health, because I've been a spot in my life where I was successful on paper, but yet on the inside, I was miserable and nobody had any idea. And so ever since then, I've really just sort of devoted my life to learning the science, learning the practical tools for what I can do, and for the thousands of other people that have taken my course, that have worked with me, that have listened to my podcast. And so, yeah. And Jim, thank you so much for having us on. I'm so excited.
Thank you for being here, Mark and Bryan. So let's get into that. Both of you have personal stories about mental health and health in general. Let's talk about, mental health during the pandemic. And as we come, hopefully come out of it, there's various challenges for the population domestically and globally. Let's get into that a little bit. So, Bryan, how are you seeing this real tragedy, right, of mental health issues across the country?
Jim, I always like to go kind of beneath the surface and have a look at what's driving it, right? And we've never seen anything in our day and age like this before. You can't get away from it. I have family all over the world, and they haven't been able to see each other. They haven't been able to travel. Usually if things are bad in the country, and I know because of where I grew up, and a good portion of the population fled, but there was always somewhere safe to go. I literally have a friend on a boat near an island right now who can't go anywhere, or couldn't go anywhere when I last spoke to him, because everywhere was closed. No one would let you in. And, he couldn't get vaccinated on a boat in the middle of an ocean. So this is overwhelming. And I think if you dig beneath the surface, the physical health insecurity, the fear we have of getting sick or dying is enough to scare anyone, the financial insecurity, the job loss that's happened. But if you have a look beneath that, or I should say at a deeper level, at the mental insecurity, the reality is our entire world has been turned absolutely upside down. There was no warning for it. People couldn't prepare. And there's no game plan for responding. We're in a first. I'm watching people point fingers. Well, this governor did this and this one did this. They didn't know any better. Not because they're idiots, just because there was no playbook for it. And we're in an unprecedented time here. And you layer on that the fact that people have had to socially isolate. The reality is, when you have to socially isolate, you have to get to know yourself a lot better. And not everyone likes what they find. Sometimes living with yourself and just with yourself can be incredibly difficult, and people have had to go through that struggle. And then I think another big underlying factor is change is very difficult for most people. We've changed everything about our lives. We've changed the way we shop. We've changed the way we live. We've changed the way we work. We've changed the way we interact, not only with our neighbors, but with our families as well. And that's created tremendous amounts of difficulty. And, stress and anxiety is just a byproduct of all those things I mentioned.
Thank you, Bryan. Mark, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, Bryan, that was well said. What I would say is, I think it's really important to realize that, like, even before the pandemic, there were many people who were literally like just hanging on by like a thread in terms of their mental health. And then you add in social isolation, quarantine, the economic factors, employment, seeing people, all sorts of different unexpected disruptions. And it's really what I would say, unfortunately, it's like a perfect storm, but for the worse. And personally, for me, like it was a very, very, very challenging time. And I had been studying this stuff for years myself, but I still really, really, really struggled, and definitely still continue to struggle with it as well. And so I can't even imagine what people, the average person, is out there even facing in terms of their mental health. What I would say is this: I think that, I think what separates maybe someone from maybe experiencing maybe more general anxiety that everybody has, to having a more serious issue with like an anxiety disorder or depression or other mental health issues, it's really just consistent loops. It's really just someone waking up and they watch the news, they stress out, maybe they lost their job, they're not sure how to pay their bills, they're eating like crap, they don't go to really sleep well. And that's fine if you do that for, a day, a week, a month. But I think what happens is if that person is caught up in that cycle again and again and again and again for the last 2 years, that's going to create some long-term mental health issues that even when the world fully opens up, it's not like they're just going to be able to step outside of their house and just, go back to normal. I mean, I've heard crazy things, man. I have friends and clients of mine, who, a lot of them maybe who have had social anxiety. It's gotten a lot worse. I have other friends of mine where if they had anxiety, some of them had developed agoraphobia, where they are afraid to leave their house, or they're afraid to see people. So yeah, it's a quite a serious problem. And I think just talking to like doctors and psychologists out there, I think what I've sort of understood is that there's a percentage of the population that is sort of going to be neutral. They're sort of unaffected. There's a percentage of the population where they are actually going to be benefited greater because of this quarantine and this time to, kind of what you said, Bryan, of people focusing on themselves. But unfortunately, there's a bigger percentage of people who have negatively impacted. And for me, what I'm thinking on is just how do you come out of that, right? So if you break your leg, our society has this entire system of like, you go to a doctor, they put you in a cast, they give you crutches, you come back the next month, maybe they give you a different kind of a cast. And then by the third month, maybe you're just on crutches and you have physical therapy. I'm trying to think about what does that process look like for mental health and for dealing with these issues at a widespread level. And so it's not good. It's definitely not good. And I think we all knew that. And so I'm just trying to talk to as many people as I can and just try to figure out like, what are the realistic, widespread education and solutions that we need to get out there. And so I think the last thing I'll say is that I think if there is any kind of a silver lining, if there is any kind of positive aspect, it's definitely that we are all now forced to look at mental health and deal with it and address it. And so, who knows what'll happen, but I definitely have hope that we'll come out of this dark time for sure.
Yeah, no, that's good to be hopeful. And that certainly is a good point, Mark, about, the awareness factor and the awareness of tools and services that could help, right? Bryan, why don't you take that and build on it as far as the rise in depression, anxiety, and stress? What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Well, I like to look at the actual numbers and the studies. There are so many opinions floating out there, and anyone who's on social media has seen those and how diametrically opposed they can be. So I always like to go to actual studies, and it's part of the industry I'm in Avadon Health anyway. But Kaiser Family Foundation brought out a great study that was published in February of this year, so just a few months ago, and they actually did some time snaps of what happened in 2018 and what happened in 2021. So I've actually got some of these written down. This is very interesting. Adults reporting symptoms of either anxiety disorder or depressive disorder, so anxiety or depression, in the period January to June of 2019, so a couple of years ago when they measured the benchmark, 11% of the adult population in the US was reporting that. They went back and had a look in January of 2021. So right here, given what we've had go on since COVID hit us, 41% of people are reporting either anxiety disorder or depressive disorder symptoms. So nearly 4 times as many people. And I love what Mark said earlier on, that if there's one bright thing that's come out of this, it's the focus on mental health. Before that was swept under the rug, right? If you had a broken leg, as Mark said, or if you had a liver problem or kidney disease or something, it was a real disease. But what was the saying if you complained about anxiety or depression? Oh, it's all in your head. Well, exactly. But look how important this is. And then you need to also go beneath that and look at the numbers behind the numbers, because different segments of the population have been affected very differently by the COVID pandemic. Just to give you some examples, young adults aged 18 to 24, when it comes to anxiety or depressive disorders, 56% as opposed to the population average of 41%. So more than half of them. I've got a daughter who's 27, and I talk with her a lot about her age group. And sometimes people of different ages and different generations have a hard time relating, but we need to sit up and listen to each other. And, a parachute can only work when it's open. It's the same with the human mind. And we need to be very open and understanding with each other and listen to different points of view and understand so that we can all help each other through this pandemic. You know, young adults are far more likely to report substance abuse, 25% versus 13% in the average population. So there are very different trends going on, and I could go on and on. We don't have time to do it. I've got all sorts of statistics. By the way, anyone who's listening, who wants to dig into this study, Kaiser Family Foundation, it was called The Implications of COVID-19 for Mental Health and Substance Use. It was published in February of 2021. A wealth of information. And when you look at that, it is so impactful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bryan. Those stats are really tragic. Now, Mark, you have a large network. You influence hundreds of thousands of young people. What are you seeing? Mostly anecdotally, I think, but what are you seeing regarding what we just mentioned and what Bryan said?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, and it's definitely a tragic situation. And I think one of the biggest trends that I've seen is there's like the effect, right, of like directly COVID, quarantine. And then as a result of that, right, there's different things that people do to deal with it, to manage the stress, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's, spending too much time on social media, too many video games, eating too much junk food. I think that's really part of what I'm noticing because, it's hard enough to be in this situation, but most people are really trying to medicate and escape through any means. And a lot of the times I feel like I see that a lot with food. I feel like a lot of the times younger people who I talk to, they'll maybe be good about not doing drugs, but then they'll drink a lot of alcohol and they'll eat a lot of junk food. And if I've learned anything about mental health, it's that, like Bryan was saying earlier, like your nutrition, your diet, that's really what your brain takes to rebuild itself. It's such a huge foundation of mental health. So what I'm looking at now too is like, there's the effects of COVID, but then there is the effects of dealing with COVID. And that's usually unhealthy habits. And like the reality is that having an unhealthy habit, unfortunately, is going to set someone else up for even more problems in the future. And so what I'm noticing is an increased epidemic of unhealthy, toxic habits that people are doing to escape for 30 minutes, but is actually leading them down a much more damaging road for their mental health. And then I think also too, when I think of, younger kids, especially kids during the like sort of ripe psychological age of like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I don't even know how this is going to affect them. And unfortunately, I think it is going to affect people, especially those kids at this time for the long term. Right. And personally for me, like my anecdotal story, I faced social anxiety and discrimination and bullying at a young age, and it affected me for so much of my life. And so I can't imagine a kid growing throughout this, not, being social, having these sort of effects, staying inside. And so it's definitely, I think it's one of those things where all of us kind of need to get hands on deck and really prioritize this. Because if we don't, then, not to talk about other issues, but whatever issue is going to come again, that's going to impact the world 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if that issue comes and we are already in the middle of a mental health epidemic, it's like we're going to see things really, really go down even more. And so it's one of those things where it's like a sort of chain reaction sequence, things that I'm seeing. And so, yeah, I think we need new solutions. We need to really step up and really find like communal solutions as well in all of our communities and societies at a public kind of mainstream level. And so I hope, we're starting to see that trend, but I hope that picks up even more.
Got it. Now, before we get to solutions, let's talk about trauma. There's a lot of trauma that's going to impact us, the population, even when this pandemic hopefully ends soon. Talk to us about that, Bryan. Are you seeing that sort of trauma, being felt and extended across populations?
Yeah. I don't even know if there's a whole bunch more than we could talk about here. I think it's become really obvious to a lot of folks. My wife's a therapist. She's actually in the next room right at the moment with patients because we both work from home. And she counsels mainly first responders and people who have either had COVID or lost someone to COVID. So, the reality of what's going on and the trauma that's hit us is so massive. And, I had COVID myself, actually, back in January. I was in an isolation hotel for 10 days. Fortunately, I used some of the tools and skills I've learned through where I work to get through that. But everyone deals with this differently, and believe it or not, genetics take a big part in this. There are certain genes for resiliency and recovery, and whether a trauma impacts you deeply or just fleetingly. And some people are deeply traumatized and will be deeply traumatized for years to come, not just from the physical issues and the fears and their health issues, but also the social change that's happened surrounding that. People who used to have a life where they went to work and they met people by the water cooler, and the kids were with childcare, and the grandparents would take them on weekends, and now they've lost a grandparent, and they'd be working from home, and now they've got to go back into the office, and the kids got separation anxiety, and one of them has lost an income, and they've had to completely downsize and move into a new house. I mean, I'm making all this stuff up. It's all just hypothetical, but these stories are going on around us every day. So there's huge amounts of trauma, and I cannot overstate the importance of finding good coping mechanisms and tools in your life for not just you, but those around you as well, because at the end of the day, we're all interconnected in some way. So the more we can help our fellow humans, the more it's going to help all of us.
Yeah, thanks for that, Bryan. So, Mark, why don't we talk to you about those solutions? What are you seeing out there in general, but also for young people? What are some tools that they might be able to, or services that they may be able to take advantage of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what the most important thing is just general education and awareness. And, I've been in this world for the last 6 years, and sometimes it's easy for me to forget that a lot of people have really never been taught like a very basic understanding of what mental health is, what trauma is, what it isn't, how do you deal with it. So I think education just in general, whether that's kind of just online education informally or different events, different like community sponsored events, maybe by different corporations, the government. I think that is really kind of the main way. But I think what's really important that I kind of see is that at least when I look at America, right? America has always been quite the individual society. And I think that's fine. But I think something with like COVID, I think we really saw the damaging effects of that. And so I really believe that we need to come together as a society and start creating communities. Like I started my own online virtual community where me and a group of people will meet up every single week. That's like a very small example, but I think we need more examples of that, whether it's done by the government, schools, religious institutions, organizations. I think that's really what we need. Like in every town, every city, every district, we need sort of a center where people can come together and learn both from professionals and professional services, but then also one another, and be in an environment where, depending on who you are listening to this, it still may be considered taboo to talk about the things that we're talking about. And so to enter that space where it's really not taboo. And so there's all different tools that I can mention, from nutrition to like socioeconomic factors. But I really think that the main way is us getting together virtually or in person and starting to educate people on these different factors together, where people can ask questions, people can learn. And then I think also too, what's really important is, I've also seen like a huge rise in, various startups and companies that have been making technology or software that can help people. Like, for example, I think the top meditation app, Headspace, for example, they've seen a huge rise. Same with Calm. So I really think what it's going to do is like a combination of sort of individual tools that a person can use like on their phone, combined with sort of a group setting where people can learn, people can share, people can be open, people can be vulnerable, and also get the professional services that they need, or at least be pointed in the right direction. And really sort of what I'm alluding to is that our society, we fundamentally need a process the same way that there's a process when somebody breaks their leg. They go to the doctor, they go to the hospital, they put them in a cast, they put them crutches, and then they come back a month, they give them physical therapy. They tell them, oh, don't do this, don't do that. I think we need sort of the same exact situation. But I think what's different about this is that, of course, I think doctors obviously have a huge role to play, but I think this is also going to be a little bit more communal, where different people, whether they are teachers or speakers or nutritionists or therapists or even leaders and executives of companies, where we can really come together and use our various skill sets to really sort of get back together through this and kind of, get together and build a community, many communities where people can come together and learn some of these tools. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is very simple. Some of it can definitely be complex for sure. But at the end of the day, I think what's really stopping people is that education and really that habit change. Just because somebody reads something in a book or listens to it once on a podcast doesn't mean that they're actually applying that in their lifestyle. So we need accountability. We need sort of consistent weekly situations where we can be in group environments where we can all learn sort of similar things. And I think that's probably going to be the best way, at least just sort of thinking out loud, in terms of how we can kind of move forward. And again, like, I'm trying to start my own version of this, and I know there's different companies and out there that are trying to do it. And so I definitely think it'll be a huge group initiative for sure.
Got it.
Those are great points. Jim, do you mind if I add to that a little bit? Because this is so important. That's a really great vision, Mark. I love it. I come from more of the tech and digital side. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because not everyone has the ability to get out. Some people are in rural areas. There's not a big population. It's hard for them to connect with others, etc. But thanks to the internet and thanks to mobile phones and other internet-enabled devices, people can really connect without physically connecting, just like we're connecting today, right? And I actually took the liberty of Googling right before we jumped online here, apps for COVID. 797,000 results came up. So it's not like there's not stuff out there. And a lot of it is built to be mobile friendly. In our particular situation, we've had a digital course called Living Easy. It's for stress management and resilience. It's a video-based course, and we've had it around for years. It was actually we developed it in conjunction with researchers from the University of Texas. It's been taught to literally hundreds of thousands of people very successfully. But I want to take a couple of things and just mention them, because I think for anyone listening to this who's struggling with stress, anxiety, etc., this may be helpful. But if you think about it, the old saying, it's better to teach a person to fish than feed them fish, because they can go and fish in any situation. It's the same thing. Once learning to deal with one particular stressful situation may be fine, but what if another situation comes up? It may be a stressful relationship, something that happens at work, something that happens COVID, with your family, etc., whatever it might be, the whole key is to build resilience. In other words, the ability to bounce back from anything. And there are certain, it doesn't matter where you go to look for this information, there are certain pieces that resilient people all do. And if you can combine these, you can build a very resilient character that can get over almost anything. And I want to just very briefly mention some of these principles. One of them that's very powerful is called reframing. And I'll give you an example of reframing that I first used. COVID came along, the whole world was falling apart, and I saw a little piece on the news about how the canals in Venice had got so clear because of the isolation that you could see to the bottom, and all the water in those canals, instead of being filthy, was beautiful. There was plant life popping up. Animals were starting to populate in areas where they were afraid because there was no traffic anymore and they could go back to their natural homes. So reframing is looking at situations differently. And if you can learn to reframe positively, it's amazing what you can find. Now, if you have some spiritual leanings, you'll probably find that easier to do. The next principle that's a really strong one is to take responsibility. Because and what I mean by that, people think of, taking responsibility, that means you've got to take on all this extra stuff. No, if you break down that word, responsibility is one of my favorite words. It's the ability to respond. If you're always feeling like you're the victim, you're never in control. Situations control you. If you take responsibility and go, okay, we're in this situation, but I'm going to make things different. I'm going to make it happen. Now you've assumed the ability to respond to the situation. Now you can work on a plan. Another very powerful tool is visualization. And that's looking at the outcome that you would like to see. The human brain is amazing. And Dr. Maxwell Maltz, a plastic surgeon, wrote a whole book about this. I read it decades ago. It's still in my mind. It's called Psychocybernetics. And he couldn't understand why two people who had plastic surgery for, let's say, a nose job reacted so differently to the way they looked afterwards. Well, your brain is like a heat-seeking missile. If you give yourself a goal and a visualization that's powerful and positive, you tend to go there unconsciously. If you think of a negative one, you go there unconsciously, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So visualization is very powerful. One of the most important things is having the self-discipline to do an action plan. When you're feeling depressed and stressed and all the rest, the tendency is to curl up in a little ball and try and protect yourself. It's called emotional coping. But if you can do problem-solving coping by going, okay, we got a problem. Let's think about the steps. Let's first visualize where we want to end up. Let's think about the steps that we want to take to solve the problem. You'll be amazed at how that gets you in control of it. And then the other thing is social support. You do want to surround yourself by positive, like-minded people where you all pick each other up instead of dragging each other down. And I'm sorry, Jim, I got on a roll there, but this is important stuff. I mean, we live, eat, and breathe this at Avadon Health. We teach people these principles all the time in our stress program. We know it works, so hopefully people out there benefited too.
Well, speaking of Avadon, why don't you tell us how Avadon uses its technology to help improve people's health, and if there are any other novel technology out there that we should be aware of.
Yeah, well, what we've done is we use the principles of health coaching and behavior change, and we meld those together with something called cognitive behavioral therapy principles, very powerful therapy principles in how you can literally train your brain to think differently, not just at a conscious level, but at a subconscious level. Those habits that you do that seem to drive you, that you don't want to do, but you keep doing them, you can actually train your brain to think differently at both a conscious and subconscious level and change those hard to break behaviors. So we take health coaching techniques for behavior change, we mix it with cognitive behavioral training techniques, and we layer that all together, and then we use a lot of technology to deliver this in a very simple, cost-efficient, very powerful way that someone can actually take these courses on a cell phone while they're standing in fact, I took a new course that we were developing on my cell phone while I was standing in line for my second COVID vaccination. I was taking sessions there. So that's a little bit about what we do. There are all sorts of apps out there, Jim, for at an organizational level. Employee assistance programs, EAPs, are adopting apps and digital solutions for people to be able to get at very quickly. There's COVID testing and vaccination and tracking apps I'm seeing are popping up in the market. Substance use disorder solutions. In fact, we have one. It's called Living Clear. It's also a digitally driven video course that people can take. There are apps on mindfulness, meditation, relaxation, sleep. We deal with sleep as well. It's a very popular one. I wish I had time to explain what goes on in the brain and why people struggle with sleep. There's two main reasons. And if you can conquer those two main reasons, you're home free, basically. But there's a lot out there. So I would encourage people to do their research. The one thing I do want to say is, if there's one thing you take away from me today anyway, it's to keep in the top of your mind that you always want to try and separate the facts from opinions. There is so much stuff out there that's opinion-based in today's media, including social media, which people take as facts, but it could be completely wrong. So learn to dig into the facts and figure out the difference between facts and opinions. And once you've done your research, charge ahead.
That's great advice. Before we get to questions, I want to ask both of you, share with us just one tip that we can use to improve our mental health. Mark, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. So I'm definitely a big fan of mindfulness. I'm definitely a big fan of meditation. I've been meditating almost every day for like the last 6 years. And it's great. And like, just for an example, I know we're talking about technology. There's this company, for example, I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's called Focus Calm. And basically what you do is you turn it on, and basically it lets you in on like a portal of like what's happening inside of your brain. And basically you can use that to just gain some initial insight to just start to like train your brain. Because I think for a lot of us who have been in this space, again, it can be sort of easy to like use this language, but for someone who's never even thought about this, you definitely need some tools and sort of some technology to give you that initial insight. And so whether it's a tool like that, there's also, many other tools as well. And for example, like another very simple tool that I would say is there's this app. It's called the Breathwork app, and it's spelled Breathwork. And basically what you do is it says, hey, do you want to be calm? Do you want to feel more awake? Do you want to go to sleep? Do you want to recharge? And basically what it does is it just teaches you and walks you through exactly how to use your breath to modulate your stress. And something simple as breath, like we all breathe every single minute, I hope, of every day. But a lot of us have never really been taught like, oh, well, if you can change your breath and you can breathe in certain ways, you actually pull like a certain lever in your brain that literally forces your brain to calm down, and for a lot of us who were never taught these tools, a lot of us were taught like, oh, if you get a negative thought, you should disagree with it, or like you should learn all these complex tactics. No, literally just learning how to use your breath and using an app like that, which is for free, can just teach you how to sort of play and pull these manual levers that are in your brain, that if you do them, all of a sudden you will literally feel physiologically a different way for a certain period of time. So that can also be like a small insight for people in terms of that are stuck in the same sort of mental tunnel where everything always feels the same and they can't get out of their emotions and thoughts. That's a great small little tool that anyone can do.
Great. Thank you for that, Mark. Bryan, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting what Mark just talked about, because I'd like to I did allude to it already, but and I hope I don't get too scientific here, but your brain is split into different parts, as we all know. Your prefrontal lobes of the brain tend to deal with your executive motor, your executive functions, your decision making, your learning, all the conscious stuff, if you would. And this is where you solve problems, is the frontal lobes of your brain. Down in the midbrain, what we call the limbic system, is where habits are stored and emotional reactions and things like that. And what happens is that middle part of the brain makes emotional decisions. And they're not necessarily logical. And those are the decisions that often take you down the wrong path. And when it comes to stress and anxiety, that's where emotionally based coping is done. What's very interesting is what Mark just talked about with breathing techniques. That's one way to calm the limbic system of the brain and calm its activity to the point that your frontal lobes can take over and you can think logically through a problem and how to solve it. And that's actually a great way to beat stress. I was talking about our Living Easy course, and it actually teaches you how to do this and coaches you step by step. But the key to successful stress management and resilience is to employ problem-focused coping techniques rather than emotionally based coping techniques. And to do that, you've got to be able to calm down that middle part of your brain's activity to the point that the front part of the brain can take over. So I would suggest to everyone, if you're struggling with stress and anxiety, go and explore that a little bit. You'll be amazed at the results.
Well, that's really fascinating. I didn't think I'd learned that much about the brain today, but I think we've all learned a lot today. But here's the first question is this: how much do you believe fear plays a role in today's stress?
Massive, absolutely massive. You know, one of the biggest fears that everybody knows about is the fear of public speaking, right? Or the fear of death. But what a lot of people don't recognize is that the fear of the unknown is one of the largest fears. And we're at a time where we don't know. It is totally unknown. We've never been here in the world before. And we've got this massive fear of the unknown, and it's driving huge amounts of anxiety. When we don't know, we fear the worst. When we know what to expect.
Got it. Mark, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the times I think of our brain as sort of like a fear detection machine. And I say that because, you know, for the vast majority of human history, you know, our brains grew up in environments where if you weren't afraid, you basically died. Like if you weren't afraid of like, hey, I'm not going to get enough food today. Hey, what's that sound in the bush over there? But our brain has also evolved to not just detect threats and fears in the physical environment. Our brain has also evolved to detect fears and threats in the psychosocial environment of like, if I don't perform well enough and I'm going to lose my job, then my family isn't going to have enough food to eat. And so a lot of times I look at our brain as that, and I frame it like that because your brain is it's not a happiness generation machine. You know, it's not a balanced machine. And so I say that because a lot of the times, if you let it, your brain is going to take you on this runaway train of being obsessed with fears and anxieties that really has to do with a much more deeper primitive survival part of your brain that is the default mode. And so unless you train in a different way, the vast majority of us are going to be stuck where instead of, you know, using our brains to help us be positive, help us be happy, be in the present moment, live the life we want to do, our brain is going to automatically just detect and imagine and try to guess fears and threats in the future. And so I think that's an important part. And so everybody has this, right? Everyone has it. And so it's up to you to be like, hey, am I going to train my mind? Because if you don't, then eventually your brain is going to train you. It's going to use you, you know? And so I think that is one of the biggest things that I've learned. And then plus an environment of COVID, quarantine, health concerns when it comes to the virus, economic concerns. And, you know, what Bryan said about the fear of unknown, again, you kind of have a real perfect storm. And so unless you're waking up every day and you're deliberately retraining your brain is going to automatically fall down this runaway train of being obsessed with fears. You're going to turn on the news. And then next thing you know, it's the next day. And the same thing happens again and again and again.
Got it. There's a question about sadness. And I know you covered a lot of territory here today, but are there any things that you would recommend that people do to overcome sadness?
Wow. Certainly one is stand the test of time. Sadness, often if it was created by a specific event, time will help to heal that. But, you know, I mentioned a little bit earlier on reframing, and reframing can be very, very powerful because it can put things in a different light. If you think about the event or situation that triggered the sadness a little bit differently, that may help to make it a less sad event.
Got it. Mark, anything?
Yes, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on sadness, and I definitely recommend people who, you know, have experienced like a loss or grieving to, you know, like look out and find those resources, find the steps that you can do to recover from that. But I think one thing that I would say in general is I think in this time, especially where a lot of us maybe are facing health insecurity, financial insecurity, I think a lot of the times it's made us a lot more serious. Right. And there's definitely a time and place to be serious. And I just say that because I feel like a lot of people have the things that they enjoy doing that genuinely lights them up, that they feel fun. Maybe it's something they did as a kid or something they did before COVID. I think a lot of us need to go back to that. And I even myself kind of find myself in these loops where I'm just like working. But then a lot of times I don't take sort of time to sort of take a break from the world and do something that I seriously enjoy, that's fun, that maybe even people consider to be silly. And I think that's so important because if you're always serious, it's going to be very easy for your brain to be sad. And I'm not saying to like run away or to like distract yourself from your problems, but you definitely need to enter into different modes. And so I think entering and doing something fun, maybe something new you haven't done in a while, I think it's going to give your brain the space to grow and to move past your current environment. And I know that there's like this great graphic online, and it's basically like, how do you deal with sadness, right? And there's like sort of a cup, and there's sort of a dark ball in there. And what you sort of have to do is like, you kind of have to let that ball sit in there, but you have to expand your cup. You have to expand your cup to the point where there is a lot more than just that black ball that's just taking up space. There's a lot more for maybe other balls, things for you to have fun, to create a new vision, a new hope, things that you never thought were possible where you can maybe achieve in the future. And so my advice would be try to have some fun and break out of the regular kind of schedule, monotonous, mundane routine, because that may give your brain and your mind some new perspective.
That's great. That's great. In fact, someone who's listening mentioned one should develop the attitude of gratitude and focus more on positive things in life. That's an approach that one could take as well. Here's a quote. One other question, Bryan. You mentioned 2 reasons why people struggle with poor sleep. You intrigued all of us. I was going to ask, but one of our folks online here asked, what are those 2 things?
I'll give you the short story because otherwise we'll be here all day. The 2 things are what you think and visualize when you go to bed and the way you feel. And the second thing is your body clock. So one is psychological, the other is biological. And probably the best way I can illustrate is a very simple example. You fall on the pavement and you end up wrenching your back and it's painful. And every night when you go to bed, you can't lie down comfortably and you fall asleep, but every time you move, you wake up. What happens is mentally, you start going to bed at night going, oh man, I haven't been able to sleep. I hope my back isn't sore tonight, but I know it's going to be, I'm going to have a hard time sleeping. Now you basically get into this big frenzy about not being able to sleep. Well, guess what? Your brain activity is so high. That limbic system I talked about has got all anxious. And because of that anxiety, yeah, you're going to have a hard time falling asleep, right? So that's the first one, is to work on using visualization exercises, meditation, things that Mark talked about so beautifully to help quiet and calm the mind. The other one is your body clock. When I'm not sleeping well because my back's sore or whatever, I tend to say, man, I've only slept 4 hours last night. I'm a zombie. I'm exhausted. I better go to bed early tonight and catch up. Well, if my body clock is used to going to bed at 10 and waking up at 6, and all of a sudden I'm trying to go to bed at 9, I've thrown it off whack. So now I may fall asleep at 9, but the body goes through a certain amount of sleep cycles every night. And there's very specific phases to those sleep cycles. And when you try a different time, guess what you do? You throw your body clock sleep cycles off. So now you wake up in the middle of the night. Now you're like, oh man, I can't go to sleep again. I'm awake. And so you lie in bed and you toss and turn and try and go to sleep. And guess what? You're retraining your brain to lie in bed and toss and turn instead of going to sleep. So what seems counterintuitive is actually the right thing to do, which is to force yourself to stay up, get into a regular habit and pattern as far as your sleep times. And actually, if you wake up during the night and can't go back to sleep, the best thing to do is to actually get right out of bed, go and read a book or watch TV or something until you're tired again, and then go back to bed. But essentially, again, those two things, what you think and visualize, and the way that you treat your body clock. Be consistent.
That's great. Great.
Can I add something?
Sure. Go ahead, Mark.
Add diet, Mark, please.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I totally agree, Bryan, in terms of those two main sleeping problems. I had sleeping problems literally throughout my entire life. I actually never fall asleep. I have memories of me being a kid, being a teenager, being a young adult, and I just wouldn't fall asleep. And yeah, I think you have to do a lot of those fundamentals that Bryan said. But I think some like tactics, some quick tips that help me. There's this exercise that you can do. It's called sleep anchoring. And basically what you do is every time, like when you're asleep or when you're falling asleep and you inhale, like inhale air through your nose or your mouth, you basically play a vowel sound in your head, an inaudible sound. So you don't say this. So let's say it's like, ah, okay. And then when you exhale, you play a different sounding vowel sound in your head. Again, you don't say this out loud. And what you do is every time you inhale, every time you exhale, you play this in your head. And literally in 3 to 5 minutes, you're going to knock out. Another thing too, is like, there's this kind of tea. It's called it's a yogi tea. It's like soothing caramel bedtime tea. That's great. I know chamomile tea is great. There's different supplements that people can take, but I definitely think some of those tips, some of those tactics have also greatly helped me too.
Oh, that's great. We can never overstate the importance of sleep, right? It's really fundamentally important to our health and our mental health. So let's end on that note, and before we go, I want you to share with us a poem or saying or quote with us today. Bryan, let's start with you.
Well, one of my favorite is he's actually from an immigrant, seeing as Mark and I are both immigrants, and his name is Jaime Escalante. He was a Bolivian immigrant and a teacher, and he became famous for taking a Los Angeles school in a very bad area with a lot of problem students and actually getting a record number of those students to pass the advanced placement calculus exam. And one of my favorite sayings, it's been attributed to other people, but it's actually Jaime Escalante's saying, is life is not about how many times you fall down, it's about how many times you get back up. And if you live your life that way, you're going to be amazed at what you can accomplish.
Lovely. Thank you, Bryan. Mark, go ahead.
There's this great quote by William Butler Yeats, and he says, the world is full of magical things, patiently waiting for your senses to grow sharper. And basically, like what this quote alludes to is that our brain is basically this supercomputer that creates this model of the world. And then based on the model of the world that our brain has created, then it dictates your behavior and it controls your behavior and what you do in the world. However, if you can start to change your brain, what's also going to happen is you're also going to see the world differently. And like, that's what that quote shows of like, the world is full of magic things that are waiting for your senses to grow sharper. And so that for me is a very powerful quote, because a lot of the times, like, we can just be stuck in this dark, static tunnel of life where every day the same thing happens. There's no sense of hope. There's no sense of we can do things differently. And a lot of times it takes, an event to sort of wake you up to then be like, wait, if I can take responsibility and focus on the things that I can control, create a new model of the world in my brain, then the world itself and how I perceive it will actually change, and therefore changing your life. So that's a very beautiful quote that I love to always think about.
Great. Both of those were great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Bryan. This is a great discussion, really informative and really helpful. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like it, leave a review, and subscribe. See you soon.